It's Banned Book Week, or Banned Books Week. We're going to talk about it today on It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free. Good morning, friends and family. It is another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after this hour with Sharif El-Mekki and me. Today, we are talking about banned books because it is Banned Books Week. There are going to be lots of activities going on. This week has been going on already. Tomorrow, there's going to be a big function. If you want to find out more about Banned Books Week, you could really just Google Banned Books Week, and it will pull up exactly that website, bannedbooksweek.org. And there is a downloadable sheet that you can get that will tell you several ways that you can participate in Banned Books Week. One of them only requires 5 minutes. One of them requires 15 minutes. One of them requires an hour. And one of them requires more time. So there's no excuse for not participating this week. What is this about? Why are we even talking about banned books? Well, as you know, there has been a big increase in recent years in the number of books that have been challenged and banned. It just so happens that the majority of those books that are being challenged and being banned are books that either are by authors of color or by authors or have subject matter regarding LGBTQIA people and students and families. So basically, it's an attack not on literature overall. It's a very specific political attack on people. And we are here to say that we are not here for it. I'm bringing in my sage on the stage, my good brother, Sharif El-Mekki, who is an educator, a principal, somebody who has had to deal with parents and politics and all kinds of other things that are, part of this issue that we're talking about today. So it's a good time for us to chime in. And both of us believe that the revolution will be literate, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good morning, sir. How you doing?
Good morning. Good morning. That's one of my favorite quotes, man. When you had that put on the shirt, I'm like, I need 3 of those because they're going to be on rotation consistently. And when I wear that out, people are like, yeah, I didn't think about it that way, but absolutely. So, it's always, an imperative that we make sure literacy is a forefront.
I mean, that's such an important point to just begin with, because we just have a problem in the United States with just people reading, period.
Just read, like reading. So without the wars, we're struggling with getting Americans literate,
literate,
you know what I mean?
Proficient.
And then you take the folks who can read words, but are, as Dr. King would talk about, just have this moral compass that's askew, right? The critical thinking that might be missing, right? We're talking about serious issues. And now it's not only are we not literate, but we actually want to decrease the reading. We want to decrease the material. We want to decrease the truth and historical accuracy. So, to layer that on top of an illiterate nation is absolutely mind-boggling. And this is how you can tell when people talk about make America great again, all that kind of nonsense. It's really make America as dumb as possible. That's what they really want.
Man, we should put that on a t-shirt.
That's a t-shirt.
Right? Take a look at this. To your point, reading is a complex cognitive process of decoding symbols in order to construct or derive meaning. Goes on and on and on. Reading is a complex thing. It's important to society, and we're having the wrong conversation about reading when we're talking about removing books from the library and banning books. This particular statement here on literacy.com basically says that 15% of United States population has specific reading disorders. 46% of American adults cannot understand the labels on their pharmaceutical prescriptions. 56% of young people claim they've read fewer than 10 books a year, which actually, if you're reading 10 books a year, you're doing good as a young person because you're doing better than the majority of Americans. 50% of U.S. adults are unable to read at an 8th grade level. Half of American adults are unable to read a book at the 8th grade level. I mean, help me out with this. Like, why are we having this wrong conversation? 33% of high school graduates never read a book after high school. A third of the population never reads a book again after high school. So this feels like this is the more important conversation. I've said it online and elsewhere. We should be talking about adding books to libraries and adding books to people's reading lists. And we're talking about banning books. Why do you think that there is a? I think we both can agree why there's a political attack on literature, and it's specifically these type of literatures. But why do you think
Mhm.
it goes by without much of a challenge?
This part or just overall
Yeah, well,
the attacks?
there's a lot of pushback on the attacks. Doesn't feel like
Yeah,
we're not animated in the way that we should be.
yeah. No, but this should be like the level of outrage, right? I think one, there's a lack of understanding of the history and where this kind of stuff comes from,
Mhm.
right? Like if people really understood, like when people are talking about like banning books, not teaching truth, erasing history, that has a long thread, right? You can look at any kind of fascist regime, oppressive regime, where they're saying like you can't read history, you can't read what we've done and what we are doing. Whether it's in the press, whether it's in materials, and so that type of censoring is and before this is America, like no, it's freedom of speech is like you don't really hear that much.
Mhm. Mhm.
According to this, it's all like, oh, you'll hear reporters say it if they're being censored, but you don't hear that from the public. Like that applies to the public as well. And particularly, and freedom of speech is also like freedom to think, freedom to read, right? Like there are threads from freedom of speech that people are not as outraged as they should be. Shout out to like Dr. Heather Harding, and the campaign of Our Shared Future. Like, one of their campaigns is Let America Read. Like that should be growing like wildfire. People should be lining up to support, to fund, and to champion her work, right? And so all of this, I think, is just when we're asleep at the wheel, when we get comfortable, when there's so many distractions, when you have when this is the short snippets of information satisfies us, then that's a problem. But we see it in the right, like the investigative reporters, for example, like that's less and less in newspapers. More and more corporations have purchased newspapers, right? And they're like, we don't really care about that really in-depth, see what's happening, see where the conspiracies are, see where the fraud is in government and things like that. Newspapers have less and less and less of those type of reporters, less and less readership, and we want everything in 20-second sound bites, 20-second clips, 20-second reels. It's harder to get outraged to read a book, to be disallowed to read a book when I'm really being nurtured and mentally neutered
Mm.
because of these distractions, man.
Um, I feel like what you just said is a big part of the solution. Heather Harding's campaign for Our Shared Future is something that should be galvanizing a lot of attention, and a lot more of us should be participating in these things. But it feels like many of us are busy with life, and we're busy. We can't be down with every cause. We may not even, you and I are aware that this is taking place because we monitor this type of stuff because we care about
Hmm.
education and we care about
Hmm.
young people being educated. But there'd be a way in which you could be very successful in banning books in the way that is happening right now and attacking authors and all that, and have the majority of the public not even really know what that issue is. And
Half of them ain't reading. So
that's the
half the
irony. It kind
population
of
is
takes
not reading.
reading.
So how are we going to get upset about a book that I'm not reading,
Yeah.
a bookstore that I'm not going to, a library that I drive by? Like,
Yeah.
what I mean? Like this, it's not in half of America's world.
Well, to that point, I mean, look at some of the books that are being challenged and attacked. The funny thing here, the craziest thing to me is some of the books make sense to me why people would consider them controversial, why they wouldn't want be everybody's thing. But like for instance, 50 Shades of Grey. If anybody has ever seen or read 50 Shades of Grey, you might see why a lot of people, would consider it, soft porn, basically. But Captain Underpants, I mean, come on, man. Like Captain Underpants is on this list. It's number 2 on this list. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Again, a culturally relevant book that has scenes in it that I'm sure that makes some people uncomfortable, doesn't rise to the level of banning a culturally important book like that. And Toni Morrison is, widely regarded as one of the best writers, that African Americans have produced and that America has produced, period. To Kill a Mockingbird. Have you ever taught this book in any of your schools?
Not To Kill a Mockingbird. Parts of The Bluest Eye, yes. When I taught, it was 8th grade, so we wouldn't use the entire book, but we definitely use clips of
Why were you
of
trying to
that for the kids
indoctrinate
to
these
announce it.
kids? Sure,
Yeah,
why are you
man.
trying to
Listen,
indoctrinate these kids?
because she, the way that she portrayed internalized racism
Mhm.
um, was so powerful, and it was really, helpful for students.
I,
But
I
I never used Kill a Mockingbird though.
I mean, I've read, of course, like many people had to read To Kill a Mockingbird in school. So it's interesting that it's now, on one of the most challenged lists. It has actually, I think, for years been on the most challenged list, but it's again becoming challengeable again. The Handmaid's Tale, Of Mice and Men, Brave New World. These are all things that have been staples in public
Yeah,
education
Brave
for
New
sure.
World, Mice
Yeah.
and Men. The
I
Hate You
mean,
Give is one that's in a lot of you know.
the hate you give to me is one of the most surprising ones to be on this list, right? It is not super explicit in any way, except for in its challenge of systemic racism,
That part.
urban systemic racism.
Yeah. I mean, and for the, for the trolls who are in the comments talking about, oh, you shouldn't be talking banned books. Oh, that's laziness. Like, yeah, what people fail to understand is this is not disconnected from the war on being culturally proficient, the war on teaching truth. This is all connected. So it's not like, oh, here are banned books and we're offended by the books. You're also offended by teaching truth and accurate history. You're also offended by Dr. Martin, because while we have these books on this list, let's know that Dr. King's books and letters from Birmingham have been banned in schools and districts. Boards have banned conversation about Ruby, little Ruby, walking to school. So it's this, and it intersects with all the other erasure, right? And so he's just like, oh, just this book. Like, no. It's much, much bigger than that. It's people who are in power and control who want to say, like, no, you can't read this. You can't read about the history of America. Oh, you can't make, little Shirley Temple, today's Shirley Temple, uncomfortable, right? Like, so these are all the things. So it's a whole, like, cauldron of stuff that they're trying to spew out into through not only state houses but through schoolhouses, and they're in concert with each other.
Yeah, I feel like you have given us, like you've given Shirley Temple a hard time before on this program.
Yeah.
What is your problem with Shirley
Well, I was
Temple?
trying to think of a common, name that surely just popped up.
You
It's
could do
not that
John
common.
Wayne, John Wayne or something else. I feel like it's really important to talk when we talk about banned books to not talk about it in a political vacuum as if it's not part of a broader effort.
Yes, yes.
So that's the really, I think, important part of this discussion. Yes, this week we can push back on books being banned, but if we to be educative of the public when we talk, if we're going to be smart about these discussions, we'll talk about the broader political context that it's in. And we've talked about this on this show before about how states are passing laws that actually limit speech and limit what teachers can teach. That is specifically aimed at rewriting the story that America tells its children about what has happened with racial politics, what has happened with discrimination, slavery, Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, how soon it was or how recent it was that America wasn't as open racially as it might be today. That is the effort. The effort is at a very high level to say the way that we're going to train the next generation is going to be to the benefit of white supremacy and white supremacists, because we are going to lessen the impact of the stories that challenge white supremacy in the United States by outlawing it,
Mhm.
basically saying you can't teach it anymore, right?
Mhm.
And here's some of the perversions that come out of something like that. Those laws get passed, and suddenly you have school districts wrangling with really silly issues, really dumb issues like, does the law say that we can teach the Holocaust the way that we've been teaching it as if it was bad? Um, and you have school districts like this in South Lake, Texas, being told, no, you have to teach both sides of the Holocaust. Well, what are both sides of the Holocaust? Help me understand, what are the two sides of the Holocaust, right? We have to tell both sides of slavery. So, in Florida, that ends up being a really perverse kind of plank or tenet in their law that basically says
Exactly.
when you teach about slavery, you have to teach about the fact that Black enslaved people actually committed crimes and violence on white people too, right? Like, so
Mhm.
forget the fact that the overall story of slavery really is about one group putting another group in absolute chattel bondage and making it hereditary for the first time in world history, creating a hereditary class of people that from that time forward would always be considered second citizen at best second citizens, at worst just not humans, right?
Mhm.
And even in our Constitution, being considered three-fifths of a person only for the purposes of counting them, right? For political power, not for the purposes of them even being three-fifths of a human. So suddenly
Mhm.
we have to teach that with a little balance. We have to do something to lessen the stain of that story. Because listen, that is a pretty deep story that indicts America in a way that I think people want to stop, us from indicting the country with. Um, and the best way to do that is to use the last bit of remaining power that you have as you are becoming the new minority, is use your last power to change the system, change the curriculum, change what people are being taught. And it does two good things for you if that's your goal. One, it retrains your white kids to not be empathetic or sympathetic about people that
Mhm.
have are marginalized and haven't made it in the same way that you have made it. So to reduce empathy in your own children, you have to retrain them. Slavery wasn't that bad. The Black people got something good out of it. They're better off having been here through
They earn
slavery and all that.
skills.
Yeah, they got some skills, right? Listen, like, wow, and it also creates another, this is the more devilish part of this. It creates this new class of people on the Black side who are emboldened by saying, I'm not a victim, and history didn't hit me in the way that it's hitting everybody else, and blah blah blah. So that's why you hear people saying, we're teaching kids that some of them are oppressors and oppressed. It's trying to retrain both of those groups to say that there's no
Mhm.
such thing as oppression. Um, it's a pretty nefarious plot, and we've got to address it everywhere that it exists. So it's not just about banned books; it's about thought control.
Mhm. Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's so interesting when they, back in the day, you would hear if anybody criticized, the status quo. Back in the day, it was like, oh, they're communists. Then it went to they're unpatriotic and un-American. Now it's just like, let's just erase it. Let's
Right.
erase it. Like, you know what I mean? Where before, like, being called a commie was like the, oh my gosh, like, no, I'm not. Listen, and then un-American. That was the thing. I remember hearing that over and over. That's un-American speech. That's un-American. This and that. Like, oh well, what exactly is un-American and American? So now they're, that kind of thing. And another thing is, like, as we're taught as like educators and parents and things like that, when you're trying to get, you know, someone, a child or anyone, like, to stop doing something, you have to replace the behavior with something. Can't just say no. You have to replace it. Like what you described is it's actually replacement language, right? Or replacing history. It's like they're done with just saying don't read it. They're actually giving the things to read, the language, the coin phrases, the description of enslavement, the description of genocide has changed so much, and then they're trying to make that the standard now. Like, hey, here's the standard way of looking at the maniacal genocidal behavior that occurred, through greed, through racism, through just savagery to wipe out an entire continent.
Hmm. Hmm.
Here's what happened to millions and millions and millions of Black people. Here's even what happened to poor white people who didn't own land, right? Like,
Hmm.
all of this is should really be a unifying thing, where we have a group who say, like, no, we're going to make that toxic to touch. We're going to connect it to this. We're going to get them to erase that, and so, as you mentioned, we've talked about this and you described it, I think, really well. The political context, when we look at this 100 years from now, looking back, you're going to see like all of the thing. It reminds me of like Animal Farm. It's like, hey, we're going to slowly change all the things that can be said, and we're going to rewrite in Animal Farm. And that was a book that we used to use. I'm surprised that's not on the somebody's banned book list. We would talk about it. While it was talking about Russia, I was like, we would teach it to our 8th grade students because it was also applicable to here.
Hmm.
Here's what can happen when someone's in power and they want to erase actually what happened. I'm going to try to remember the phrase before the end of the show of like just how they had changed some of the language, which changed the understanding of what people had experienced.
I mean, this is such a good point because, well, let me give somewhat of an analogy. I've been watching a lot of court TV on YouTube, of course, and I don't know
Why?
why.
Why?
Like, listen, there are these there are these videos, or these like, yeah, it's a YouTube genre of people hearing their sentences in court, and so like they take you into the court, and some people freak out when they get a heavy sentence. I like the ones where the victim's parents get to like jump over a banister and get to the person that is being convicted, so they get a few licks in or whatnot. This sounds terrible. I know it sounds terrible, but it's good entertainment to watch how some of this goes down in the courts. But one of the things that I think is interesting is right before a judge gives a sentence, the judge will be saying like, you did X, you did Y, you did Z, you showed no remorse, you showed no compassion, blah, blah, blah. This is all leading up to sentencing. Now, if you imagine the power, if there was the power of that person who's being convicted at that moment to say, I don't want to talk about any of that. Yeah, Judge. As a matter of fact, I want you to erase all of that from the record as we start talking about sentencing, because there's not going to be a sentencing if I have anything to say with it. So, imagine if you were the person being convicted and you had this power to just be able to say, strike that from the record. We're not going to talk about it. Well, everything you just said is the record. You formed a country on the backs of people and ground them into the sand, even as they were being compassionate to you and teaching you how to live and survive in the wilds, and you couldn't do it on your own. You really did devious kind of genocidal things to this people. It's the public record. It's the truth. There is no getting around it. I don't care how you feel about it. It is what it is, right? This is what you did to this group of people. And you got worse and worse as time went on. If you think about Andrew Jackson and others in the Trail of Tears and what happened over time to this people, and then if you see the state that they're in today, knowing what they once were, the record is the record. It doesn't matter if you want to just tell the judge, throw it out, judge. I don't want to talk about that anymore. What you did to enslave people is not just a story. It's not just slavery. Slavery is just like a lazy way of talking about what really actually took place. We are talking about rape. We are talking about child rape. We are talking about violence, maiming, daily terrorizing, training of people to be less than in very brutal and hostile ways. That if anybody did any of these things today, there would be no judge in the world who would do anything but throw you in the slammer for years and years and years and years. So imagine the power just saying, I don't even want to talk about that.
Yeah,
I don't even want that to be,
we don't
let's
need to
take
do
that
that.
off the record,
Mm-hmm.
right? Do we want to take COINTELPRO off the record, where your own government actually actively worked to destroy and make you kill each other in communities that were already marginalized by race and class and everything else? Do we not want to talk about that? Is that off the record now too? Do we
Mm-hmm.
want to just talk about the greatness of America without talking about the seriousness of the charges against America? What we see right now is we see a convict wanting to erase the record so that they are not convicted. That is a
Yes, the
problem.
convict is trying to erase the record.
The,
That's
the convict is trying to erase the record.
Yeah, And what did George Orwell say? Something to the effect like, "Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past."
Mm, mm. Oh,
Right?
wow.
Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. And so that piece, that idea of control, erasure, how to manipulate, and then connecting it to all of it. Again, from state house to schoolhouse. These aren't disconnected things, right? And so when we talk about like the level of outrage, this is why these conversations have to be elevated, pushed, broken out of the echo chamber. Because I think a lot of times the conversation stays in, like, yeah, you're talking about it at your dining room table and amongst your friends. I'm talking about it at my table on the road to soccer and amongst our friends. But like, there's such a significant number of folks who are not, again, reading books or not
Hmm.
reading
Hmm.
in this. And so where they get their information, where they get their materials, some of them look at like, hey, you know what, not teaching about this, like, yeah, this is the way towards a more anti-racist country, is if you just don't talk about race. Like, you hear arguments like that, like, don't talk about it and everything will be much better. It's like the new version of being colorblind.
Hmm.
It's like, but it's basically like, let's remain ignorant and happy, right?
Ignorance
Like,
is bliss,
ignorance is
isn't it?
bliss, right? Like,
Isn't ignorance
this is,
bliss?
and they're implementing that, right? Like, don't make anyone uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Don't make like anything so just imagine, like, if you're trying to design, this, a state of control. You want people to be like, well, don't bother me with being anything uncomfortable. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I don't want to see, those monkeys can't see, can't hear, not even know evil, like no truth. Like, forget like don't see no evil. It's like, don't see truth.
You know what?
This is the new truth. Anybody, alternative facts. Like, alternative facts means
Alternative
like,
facts.
it doesn't really matter. Like, we
That's
can
right.
all just decide what history has been. That's
Yeah, we
it.
used to call this relativism. We used to call this moral relativism. That's what
Mhm.
conservatives used to call it. Like nothing means nothing. It just means whatever we want it to mean. There is no
Oh,
truth. Alternative facts. So that is a good turning point when a lot of this happened. I would love to get, I know you got to run soon. So I want to get your opinion though about how much of this relates to what we know in history when people used to invade countries and burn down libraries as like a
burn down libraries.
first act of business. Let's burn down the libraries. They did
Carry
this
what you can,
in
burn
Egypt.
everything else.
I
Yeah,
don't know many people know this, but there is
the
a
Greeks.
big portion of human history now that is missing because one of the first acts of business for people that wanted to colonize in Africa was to burn all of the ancient texts and all of the knowledge that had been formed for humans previous to them because they wanted to recycle that history into something that they owned themselves. They wanted to tell the stories themselves. So, what do you see in
Yeah,
that analogy of the way they're trying to rewrite the story today and the way that history has already shown us how that happens?
yeah. I mean, and everything. History just constantly repeats itself, right? What did I think Tony say? Nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. Like, this is, the new sun is here. Like, this is, learning about those kind of things in elementary school. I think, again, back to teachers, back to, connecting teaching to activism, and understanding, and showing, like, historical understandings of, you know, Greeks coming and studying in Egypt, and then going back and, returning with,
Mhm.
for acts of war, and burning down, uh, these texts, and people got to understand, like, we would actually look at, like, text back then, to write something was so painstakingly hard on sheets of paper in these huge first libraries, right? And when you connect that today, that, we burn them down with a stroke of a keypad.
Mm.
Like, that's how easy it is, with a signature on a bill. And so when
Wow.
we see 44 states, that's what they're continuing to do. They're burning down, this, you know, libraries, like intellectual, cultural, historical writings, truths, history, to just constantly find ways to burn it down, and then decide, here's the alternate book, here's the
Hmm.
alternate language, here's the alternate fact for you to digest and ingest. I think all of this, we talk about this so much, Chris, that all of it takes a level of vigilance.
Hmm.
And I think this is why, when you're bombarded with so many issues, it's hard to be vigilant on all fronts, even though they're all connected.
Hmm. Hmm.
They're all connected, right? So it make you think like, well, I can't focus on this because I'm focused on that. That is that. This is that. And you see it, all the connection when you look at how the country was constructed, from redlining to, when you look at today, you see the same environmental racism and the health disparities. All of these were policy decisions
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
still reverberate to today, right? And so, if we're not vigilant about this, that means we're also not. These other things aren't in the peripheral. They should all be right, in our scope.
Well, brother, I know you got to run. That was a lot of wisdom as always, and we appreciate you. We know that you are on the road doing amazing things. I'm going to stick around with our audience here and just take care of some of the comments that we have, because we have good people
Yeah,
that have left comments, and we don't want your comments to go
yeah.
untouched in this
And that,
particular
and you
show,
know, and
because
that
we
one
appreciate
that,
you
that we
so.
have right up there now, like Michelle Johnson, like absolutely, they give two different, Bibles. You know what I mean? And also understanding, like, again, back to all this stuff is connected. Black people were the only group of people where reading was illegal.
Mm,
So
mhm,
just think of
mhm, mhm,
all the like craziness that, and pillaging and plundering and murder that happened on these soils, in this land. There was one group that it was illegal to have a pen. So somebody else could actually, so that was a crime
mhm,
to have a
mhm.
pen, to have a book, to be talking about, letters. That was illegal. And so now, instead of making it illegal, it's just like, all right, how do we get the same impact and effect, but doing it differently?
I mean, and it's still in some ways making it illegal, because if you notice, when Florida attacked AP, it didn't attack AP European history. It didn't
Mhm.
tackle AP German or AP kind of like white world. It attacked very specifically AP African American studies, and wanting to gut certain scholars out of it, wanting to gut certain premises out of it that had been put together by Black scholars, that had been put into AP by Black scholars. So why just that one? You just mentioned it years ago. They outlaw reading and literacy for African Americans to keep them in a perpetual state of ignorance and servitude. And today, all these years later, when we have supposedly made so much progress, we can have governors that specifically Alabama, Texas, Iowa, Florida, white governors looking for a white constituency to get support from them by beating up on Black people and Black studies, and acting as a barrier between Black students and families like mine, ability to learn about ourselves in our own tradition of scholarly thought. Why are we the whipping boy in 2023? Why is it possible for you to get political favor specifically by picking a fight with us and rewriting
Mhm.
our history? Because that's all it is, right? Let's
Yeah,
just be
yeah.
clear. This is just theater. It's just political theater, and we're
This,
the whipping
this is,
boy.
and their
Um,
grandparents used to ban anti-slavery literature.
mhm,
You know,
mhm,
like
mhm,
like they were like, that was illegal to have in the South anywhere. Even for white people, you
mhm.
can't have anti-slavery. David Walker's appeal. Still nobody knows like what happened to David Walker after that pamphlet was being distributed by Black sailors and white abolitionists, and reading that was like, oh, this book is illegal, and we will kill the person who wrote it.
This is a great point too for people that are listening and just heard what Sharif said. You may not know this story, but David
I'm gonna
Walker
run
was,
to
you got
explain
to
that.
run,
Yeah.
brother. We'll see you soon.
All right.
Um,
Thanks a lot, man.
David Walker was a Northern abolitionist who also published a lot, and he published pamphlets because back in the day, pamphlets, I think, were the version of a tweet or a blog post or something like that. And he would have Northern seamen who were going to travel down south along the coast sew in these pamphlets into their coats so that they could be distributed amongst enslaved people to let them know that there is freedom. There is such a thing as freedom in the world. And just the act of writing these pamphlets and distributing them made them like explicit material and something that the powers that be wanted to stop from happening. And they did. They used law, they used terrorism, they used all kinds of things to stop the flow of information. This wasn't, stopping violence or anything like that. It was considering the language that he was using as violence itself against the regime, against the way that they wanted to order society. So let's get to some of your comments, because Freedom Friday is about all of us. It's not just about me and Sharif and sometimes Ishmael and sometimes Dr. Charles Cole chopping it up. It's also about the comments of what you have to say on a Friday. So I want to tend to it. First of all, I want to start with Sharif mentioned earlier that there was a hater in Twitter, and we are still calling it Twitter, by the way, hater in Twitter world who basically was coming at us for something. I mean, basically, what did he say here? He said that basically it's intellectually lazy to talk about the banned books without talking about why they're being banned. And I assume that he is asking us to talk specifically about the fact that there's explicit material. And it's not just that they're being banned just for any other purpose other than the fact that they may be inappropriate, age inappropriate for kids. So listen, we can argue about that all we want, but this is what I'll say. One of the most challenged books is Genderqueer. I read Genderqueer as a person where this wasn't really my story, and it wasn't really what it's not really what I need to read in the world. But then again, libraries are full of things that I don't need to read, and I love libraries. I have always loved libraries, but I've always known how to find in a library my stuff, the stuff that like relates to my life and relates to what I care about. I read Genderqueer just because I wanted to see what all the hubbub was about. I wanted to see what was the problem with it. If you read it, it's a graphic novel that talks about, it's a coming of age story that talks about the coming of age of a queer youth in a family of kind of hippie-ish, naturist type of people. And it's just an insight into their family and into their world. And there are ways of thinking about this particular book that I think we should adopt in terms of kind of like a universal agreement with each other. I read the book. It made me very uncomfortable. It was like reading somebody else's email. It's not something that I need in my world for me because it's not my life and it's not my pathway. And on top of all that, I'm a mature American who knows that not every single book is for me. It's not it's not just like the Hate U Give tells more of a story that connects with me, but somebody else might read that same story and say, I have no idea what this is about. This isn't really about me. So, citizen maturity might be for us to say, just because something isn't for me doesn't mean that something is bad, and that I get to define what that should be for other people. My biggest takeaway from Genderqueer is it's not directed at me. It's not for me. It did make me uncomfortable in several ways, and it also made me kind of enlightened and smarter in several ways. What I was able to see, though, was this could save some kid's life. If some kid was having the same pathway that this particular queer youth had, this book could be very meaningful, their mental health, to their place in the world, to them understanding the world. So it's a little bit crude and gross to treat this particular book like it was illicit material just because it's saying things that make you uncomfortable. There's another quote here earlier, and we have Ish is about to jump in with us here as a teacher. I'm gonna say this before he jumps in here because I don't want his smoke on this particular one. But we have a comment here from Starleona Johnson, who basically says the No Child Left Behind Act really messed up adults being able to read. And this goes back to the earlier part of our conversation when we were talking about the fact that there is a reading problem in the United States. Why are we banning books? Why are we taking literature off the table when we need to put more literature on the table that's relevant to different parts of the population? Because we need them reading. And a lot of y'all need to read. And a lot of y'all, if it's not you, you have a cousin or uncle or an aunt or somebody that's spending way too much time watching either World Star Hip Hop or Fox News, and they need to actually just pick up a book a little bit more than they do. But this particular point on the No Child Left Behind Act really messed up adults being able to read. I don't know how. I don't like. I will defend No Child Left Behind as a logical way to create one, to get the data that we need to know how kids are doing, two, to disaggregate that data by race so that states can't hide the kids that that are not doing well and are not succeeding, and three, to have third-party objective information so that we know what schools are working, what teachers are working, what curriculum is working, what isn't working. So that's what I will defend No Child Left Behind. We could do a whole nother story on that. But I think the thing that stops Americans from reading is that increasingly over time, Americans became more entertainment addicted and less text addicted. And that happened long before No Child Left Behind. We are very much a visual entertainment culture and not very much a reading culture. L. Michelle Johnson says, they use the shock of sexually explicit text as cover for the social and racial design that is the end goal, meaning they scare people, scare tactics with some of these books like Genderqueer and some of what they consider to be sexually explicit or racially explicit content. Not because those things are really the issue, but because they actually want to use that as a motivator to portions of the public to stoke their animus against other groups, so that could be politically useful for them on the main front, which is basically to create a new white order where they get to define everything. They get to define what is and isn't appropriate, who is and isn't appropriate, what groups are worthy and what groups aren't. I'll leave that one there. L. Michelle Johnson also says public education has always manipulated the narrative. I'm going to need you to tell us a little bit more about that comment. I don't know exactly what that means, but I feel like I can feel it in my bones. Yes. As much as people say that they don't want public education to be about indoctrination, the institution of public education has been used for years to indoctrinate young people into patriotism, into capitalism, into militarism, into racism in so many ways. All the things that Dr. King talked about and hated, public schools have been a vehicle for creating the next generation of dummies on those particular issues, even though I'll say public education has also done some good. So anyways, I'm going to jump out of this and bring in Ish to talk to us, because he is the teacher who can educate us on some of these issues. And Ish, I don't know how much of the discussion you picked up on earlier when we had Sharif on, but we've been talking about Banned Books Week from the perspective of why is there not more pushback on it? One, two, do we even understand it as being a big threat? Like, is it a big threat that some books are being removed? I would love to ask you, do you know of any of the books, and do you care even? Are these books that you care about? Because you and I talked last week about books we would put in the schools. Mm-hmm. Now, I just want to be very honest with you. All the books we mentioned last week that we would put in the schools would be banned if people knew about them, right? So I just want to forecast what you and I would put in schools would already be banned. Does this affect you? You're a teacher, you teach, you've taught social studies or whatnot. Does this topic at all affect you and the kids that you were talking about?
I would say it affects as another lesson that folks can point to, right? Another example that shows kind of this idea of like intellectual freedom actually exists in the society. And there's many examples, like you can go World War I, right? Where they were just straight up sweeping people up if they had any type of stuff around unions in certain places. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So like this idea that folks were able to operate with intellectual freedom is a fallacy, I would argue, in this society. And if it has existed, it existed for about like 5 years, right? You know what I mean? And so when we talk about banned books, I couldn't tell you what's on that list maybe the turtle one in Florida. See, I don't even know the penguin one. See, I'm not sure. But the larger point and issue is you should be paying attention to those trends, right? So if you're seeing the upsurge, uptick of it, if you're starting to see like folks almost darn near burning books, right? Those are like red flags that something more sinister is brewing underneath, right? And even within those content, hopefully that motivates more folks to read, because like you were saying, this society definitely has a reading issue. But at the same time, when I was a teacher, that did not affect me at all. And if there was like talk or like, article that I ran across that was very interesting looking into it, that conversation might be brought into the classroom. It might be related to what we considered to be the value of education compared to what type of education, and then decided by whom, right? So like these layered type of conversations, that's why when you even talk about what should be allowed and what shouldn't, already you're getting into a very hard conversation where a lot of those decisions that really matter already were made about what should be included and what should be excluded. So like you're arguing semantics at the end point of like very fine, important at times details. But this society is always engaged in that type of censorship, and looking at the history of it and also recognizing the uptick now, I think are the best lessons that we can get from book bans.
In your time, in your experience, has there ever been books where you thought that book has gone too far, or there should be a line somewhere? Have there ever been books where you're kind of like, yeah, I would ban that one? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say ban it. I would definitely say like, when the book, Buck was going around and they were like, this is so good. And they had middle schoolers reading this book by M.K. Asante, who actually has some good stuff out there. 500 Years Later is a great documentary that he has on the transatlantic slave trade. But this fictional book that he did called Buck follows this coming of age teenager in Philadelphia using all the slang and like problematic kind of behavior. And it seems to glorify it a little bit. So like things like that, it's kind of like bad hip hop. I wouldn't necessarily ban it. But if it comes on or like somebody tries to give it play, I'm like, turn that off. You know what I mean?
You're not going to fight for it, but
No.
you don't want to ban it.
Yeah, exactly.
What if I told you that like books like Mein Kampf and some related books became part of a small group of canonical books that were used to radicalize young white youth into a way of thinking that we all kind of fight against, in the main world, which is, violent, white racial activity. And, some people would say, yeah, but, you are allowing them to read these things, starting with maybe Catcher in the Rye, and then eventually getting down to some stuff around Aryan Nation type books, and then getting around to some like, David Duke and, the New Order type books, and, of course, Mein Kampf. And then now all of a sudden you have anti-Semitic, angry, hostile young white men who do something like, the bombing in Oklahoma, or, going into a grocery store and shooting up a bunch of people at church. I mean, does that make you uncomfortable in terms of having access to, at a young age, to books like that?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely would give me pause. I'm still very hesitant on banning. I think a conversation around the way you're talking about those books should be part of larger conversations when we talk about what should and what should not be talked about, right? And those conversations should be happening in classrooms over like many years. Now, I would also say I kind of feel the same, and I'm not saying it's the same, but I feel the same way with certain things that our children are exposed to at a young age right now anyway. And would I go and say like, no, that should not be accessible to those children? Because I mean, like, yes, But at the same time, it's like, I don't think it's the authority of the, the law necessarily is the solution, right? Because then you're talking about fugitivity associated, and that becomes a little bit more glamorous, right? Kind of like that book ban stuff. Some of them books are getting picked up now because they were banned, not because necessarily they're great books. But so like when we're talking about that kind of idea, it's a much more unclear answer. I definitely think that this society kind of produces those type of concepts and ideas in many different variable ways, and not just to radicalize our own. So.
We have movie rating systems. I mean, why do we have movie rating systems? Why do we have movies that are like NC-17, meaning no kid under 17 can see these movies, even with a parent? I think that's the way that it goes. I'm not 100% sure, so don't hold me to it. But we definitely say like rated R movies require you to come with a parent. My kid wanted to go see one of these scary movies, Exorcist type movies that are out, because he's all into these horror movies, and him and his friends were going to go and watch it. Now, I don't know why they were going to do this, because later that night when they got home, they were going to be sleeping with the lights on and stuff.
Yeah.
But they got turned away. No, you do not get to see this movie. You are underage. Why do we do that for other parts of the culture, but we don't do it for books?
I mean, that's a great question, because when you were even, giving the example, I was thinking about like music. When I was like a 14-year-old, I remember getting refused buying my favorite rap album because it had parental advisory. Obviously, I was able to convince my parents to go get me that anyway. But it does kind of show like that does exist within our society. And it is interesting when you talk about books. But like then the question would be like, who would decide what would be the level, right? With certain like political content, when you're talking about in that book, would that be considered, NC-17 if you're describing something? Because books do describe things in different types of ways than even seeing it on screen at times. You know what I mean? But that is an interesting question. Why don't they do it to books? Maybe there's like millions of industries. I don't know.
And I'm just for the record, I'm not promoting that as an idea, but I do think it's an interesting question, because
I never thought of that.
Listen, my dad had problems with Prince when I first started bringing Prince albums home. As a matter of fact, I've told this story before. The way that I first became interested in Prince or knew about Prince was a friend whose dad made him get rid of the album, so he gave it to me. He was like, my dad said, I can't have this. so I'm giving it to you. Now, I had access to Richard Pryor albums, to Red Fox albums. I don't know if you have read or had listened to some of these albums from back in the day, but they were really caustic. They were definitely adult themed materials and stuff, but I had access to those albums. So then, this Prince album comes in, and this was the thing that my dad was going to be like against. He was like, no. That is covering themes that are not for you. This is not for you. Even though I was already listening to, like I said, Richard Pryor, Red Fox, some of the nastiest comedians that existed. This was his threshold. Like, no, in this household, we don't do this particular album. And now that I'm older, back then, first of all, what happened? Because he did that, I bought every Prince album after that and listened to it in private in my bedroom. Had a record player in my bedroom. For those of you who have heard this story before, Cut School, on the day that 1999 came out, stole $12 in quarters from his quarter drawer, and Cut School went to the mall and bought the Prince album, came home, and Cut School that day put the whole album on and played the whole thing a couple of times in the privacy of my room, knowing that I would be in trouble if I got caught. But that was all because he banned it. It was all because he said, I can't do this. Guess what I did? Went bought me an album. And today I feel the same way about some hip hop. So you just mentioned hip hop. I don't know that there's some of it that I wouldn't rate out of the hands of students. I don't know that I would want to get tangled up with parents saying it's my right to be able to let my kids, listen to this. But, I mean, not everything is for everybody.
Yeah.
And what would you do as a person who loves hip hop if someone like me came along and said, you know what? There's some of this that's going to be rated R. Some of this hip hop is not for children under 16, for instance. Would you go along with me, or would you would you have the attitude I'm having about banned books and be like, no, just because you don't like it doesn't mean that others can't like it?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously through lived practice, I definitely agree with the latter, right? That, I remember not being able to buy Snoop Dogg's first album because I wasn't old enough. And if you listen, if you listen to it, I remember listening to it when I was a child and listening to it when I was older. There's definitely things and ideas that I did not pick up on
Mhm.
when I was younger, right? And today it is a little bit much more hardcore, right? What was considered hardcore, like that Snoop Dogg thing, would be light compared to some of the stuff that they even play in the radio sometimes. Um, I don't. I personally give certain stuff no play because of the lack of substance, right? And that makes me a little bit more hardcore because that like narrows a lot of the music that I actually listen to. And the boys, my boys get no play in the car. But at the same time, I don't necessarily. I've heard arguments from former students and students over the years that basically, make the case like you would have made the case with that Prince album, right? That's just music that you really enjoy it. You don't understand why you can't listen to it, right? And even if the content is extreme, like drill music, my Lord, man.
Mm.
As a parent, you should just know, be like, your child might be in trouble. You should just check in. You know what I mean? Even if they're just, you know, uh, you know, fantasizing about violence, right? That's a whole nother ball game. But when it actually comes to music and responsibility with kind of the difference between what's real and what's just like talked about in those songs, I think that that's something that should not necessarily be banned simply because I remember being denied that Snoop Dogg album and having to wait like 3 weeks until my dad was, I convinced my dad to go buy it for me. And I had to do that for like 2 years or something. And then they stopped caring about it all of a sudden. So
I
that
think you
also,
got to have some consistent rules in place too. I mean, Snoop Dogg seems, now looking back, he seems mild in comparison, but he was back then at the leading edge of what was considered to be gangster music. I
yeah.
don't know why, because he was the most mild mannered of all that. But listen, what I just told you. How arbitrary is this about the Prince thing? But my dad would let me listen to Rick James.
Exactly.
Right? He didn't have a problem with Rick James. He had a problem with Prince. Well, I think, there were some gender situations there that he was trying to defend and protect. But somebody in the comments, Eric Williams said, we ban books, but allow Sexy Red. Society sucks. And Sexy Red, this is how old I'm getting.
Yeah,
I
I know.
find out about people long after they're famous, like, who is Sexy Red? And then I go find out. I'm like, well, goddamn, I'm hoping no kid is listening to any of this. And even some of the Cardi B stuff and the Nicki Minaj stuff or whatnot. First of all, if you have a daughter and this is the programming that you are letting them listen to, God bless you. But this is not something that I think is appropriate for the development of a girl. So now all of a sudden I'm in the role of somebody that wants to be prohibitive about some things. And it even gets worse. Sexy Red just came out for Donald Trump, so as a hip hopper, she's like, and she's trying to push the idea that the hood loves Donald. So now I'm ready to ban her on multiple levels. Political explicit nonsense is not good. Well, anyways, as we wrap up, I know we're at the end of time here. I want to give you the last word on the subject matter about sometimes we're just defensive and we fight against things, like fight against book bans. What would be the positive step forward that we would take if we weren't just like about defending, but we were about building? What would be the positive way we would use this moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, I see it already. Some folks going out of their way and like making ban book lists, right? That folks distribute amongst one another and use that at list as a guiding post for some of the stuff that happens in their classroom, right? And then the conversations that come out of that. So I saw that, on social media. I was like, oh, wow, that's a interesting idea of approaching it. I would also say use it as another example, right, of kind of like a canary in the coal mine in regards to where discourse has been reduced to within this society right now. We do have these kind of like bubbles of inflate. Like if I see like talk to somebody who like advocates banning of some books, like I don't know if they live in the vicinity of me. If they, you know what I mean? Like if they live in Philadelphia at all. I know that the folks that I work with think it's ridiculous. Even asking if we ban any books is kind of like, that's not the way you ask this question. So I think by default, by having these situations and elevated, because it's always there in the background, but elevated.
I think you may have froze up, Mr. Philly. It was a very important word. Oh, there you go. You froze up for a second there. Now you're back, brother.
I apologize.
No, you good, man.
And push, and push back. So just like talking about how these books are being banned for these reasons, there's politics involved. Why is there politics involved in the books that we read? Why are certain other ideas, right? Like the question you brought up about being able to listen to Rick James, but not Prince. And even the reason that you cited real quick, that's a conversation with.
The COINTELPRO just don't want you to be great, brother.
See
We
that.
appreciate you.
Fully
So I
barred
caught
up.
most of what you say. Yeah. Well, we appreciate you as always, brother, and all the work that you do with you and Sharif do with dedicating your lifelong work to being education, educating the public, educating children, and educating young people. That for me really is the way out. It's the way out of most of what we're doing here, because there has never been, I've said it before, there's never been a revolution predicated on ignorance. Ignorance has never been the thing that has saved people. As I wrap up here at the end of this, I just want to, I want to address two comments by Mark Gaskins, and then I want to leave you with something positive that you could do specifically to work on banned books week. So first of all, Mark Gaskins, the first thing that he mentions here is, do we really trust school leaders and teachers with our children to have their best interest at heart? And when it comes to things like explicit materials and what materials are okay and what should we be allowing our kids to have access to, we have to be able to trust that there is a mediating group of people who are educated and understand the criteria and the rubrics for how you make these decisions, because they have to mediate the difference in a very complex society. The United States is more diverse than almost any country in the world, which means we have to be really good at mediating difference, which means we need experts who are trained, who have objective criteria to be able to make some of these decisions, because there are going to be parents like me that want something very different than the parents who are banning genderqueer. And so, yes, I need to trust the American Library Association has some science behind what they do and what they think. I have to trust that librarians are people that have a science to what they do. They have a process. They have a level of understanding. They have objective rules and ways to mediate difference, so that we have the richest possible set of free knowledge and free information in libraries as possible, without actually having things in there that do damage to people and real harm. That's a very hard job. So yes, I have to trust them, even though I get what's behind the question mark. 100%, I will be something that says trust but verify. Teachers aren't always the expert, and neither are any of our institutions. But in this case, I trust those institutions to hear us all out more than I trust the parents who are trying to ban the books, more than I trust the right-wing forces that are trying to ban the books. I don't trust them at all. So if it's a battle between them and the American Library Association, or librarians overall, or the science of being a librarian, I'm going to pick the librarians 100% end of day, no problem. And then, excuse me, you make another comment here about workshops and PDs for parents and teachers about banned books, reduce the fear of the unknown and build conversations. And I think this is in response to what can we do that's positive when we're seeing something like, banned books. The energy is to be defensive and to defend something. And this question about what can we do that's actually proactive and moves us forward, I think you just gave a really good answer. We can partner with our schools and our districts to answer these questions as rationally as we possibly can, to make sure that we have shared information about what's actually going on so that none of us can be abused by our ignorance, and to work positively together about answering these questions rather than everything being about a fight and marginalizing people and screaming and going to board meetings, trying to disrupt and create chaos and pit parents against parents and parents against educators and educators against themselves. What you just said is actually a more productive, I think, way of going. So the last thing that I'll say, I said I'll give you guys something positive to be able to do. If you go to bandbooks.org, there is a lot of information about this week, the Banned Books Week. And one of the things that I appreciate from them is they give you this cheat sheet of, if you want to be involved and you want to be a warrior for literacy and you want to do, like, great things for reading and for kids and whatnot and for books. If you have 5 minutes, there are 3 things here that you can do. You can, call decision makers. You can support an advocacy organization, and you can join the Unite Against Book Bans, which is a campaign, and it's an effort to fight book bans. Likewise, if you have 15 minutes, there's several things here that you can do. And if you have 30 minutes, there's 2 more things that you can do here. And if you have an hour or more, there's a few things that you can do. So whatever level of ninja you want to be on this particular issue, there's something for everybody to do. As always, we appreciate you as the people that come here and have community with us around these important issues. We try to shed some light, but we also try to be, I think, a little bit provocative. Big thanks to Sharif and Ish for coming in and teaching, as always, sharing their gifts with us and with you. And as always, this has been another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you are freer after this hour with us than when you began. Peace. If you like the show, share it with your friends and family. Give it to them as a gift wrap it, do whatever you need to do, but get this show out, and